I'm here visiting. We're having a meeting from a working group on post-colonial Europe, and I come from Complutense University in Madrid, Spain. I also use your work. Thank you so much for your work in my approaching my teaching on the African diaspora. I would like you to say a word if you want to. To add a word on what you said on the mosaic, because of the mosaic. I've been using the metaphor all the time as opposed to the melting pot. I mean, the melting pot has been equated in our studies, as you know better than myself, in the US context. And I've been using for many years now, when teaching Canadian. The Canadian approach was the mosaic.
General discussion, clarification point, what is the question?
So, a word on the mosaic and the linking, because I've read stuff, the linking of the mosaic to the ghettoization of culture, and why were they selling us this mosaic thing from Canada, saying it was more advanced than it was better and it would solve all our problems?
I think for me the melting pot belongs in the 19th century. You know, the idea of it, we know the history of it with Israel Zangwill and the relationship it brought in his experiences in Europe. We went to the United States and all of that. I don't know if anyone's been working on the play and knows Zangwill's legacy. It's an interesting place that melting pot came from. And Werner Solos did that really good work on the melting pot too. I think that the reason that I agree with you about the Canadian provenance of that mosaic, but it always bothered me because it seemed to correspond to certain features of the forms of segregation that were naturalized in US cities. When I spoke earlier on of the racial nomos, you know, I was thinking about that. So people say, well, of course, this is a diverse, it's a world city, but you know that on this block there are the Dominicans, and then this block there are the Puerto Ricans, and then this block there are the people from El Salvador, and this block there are the Turks, and this block there are the Turkish Cypriots. So it's a micro map that you need, and how much flow. I'm not going to deny that in places like Queens in New York, there is a conviviality there, but we don't yet really have a map of it. And the way that our segregation works, certainly in my own city, London, even though that is changing now and becoming something much more like an American pattern because of the hyperinflationary housing market and the pressure on housing stock and the way that the housing is distributed and organized, there's a kind of a spatial integrity to those things. In our country, in the 50s, never mind the 60s, when the immigrants came from the Caribbean, you know, to live in places like Birmingham, when I was a student there, I was always really struck that the people who ran the city said, we don't want these people living next door to each other, because if we do, they'll cluster and that will produce ghettos and whatever. And these were people already who were forced out of the rental market. Many of them were buying houses in very poor state, you know. But the effect of this was that because they weren't allowed to live next door to each other, where the housing was allocated by the government, they would live 2, 3, 4 doors apart. So there'd be a Caribbean family there, and an Irish family there, and then there'd be local people who were Irish from a different wave of migration would be there. And this produced cultural consequences of an interesting kind. You know, I mean, it was only a very slow process that produced these nodes or cluster points. So for me, the mosaic, I like certain aspects about it, but it suggests that these integral pieces are stable. Whereas, I mean, you know what the half-life of this piece is, right? And yet, you know, we have anthropological and sociological stuff which tells us that piece isn't fixed. It's breaking down. It's half-life. It's decaying all the time. And it's not just a process of decay, actually, because you know, after one generation, people want to remember some things, or they want to forget a lot. But after 2 generations, they want to remember a lot and forget very little. So it grows. It's almost as though it's expanding and contracting. It has a kind of breath in it. So it's not something that's a fixed piece. We could work on the idea of the metaphor, of the mosaic, but we need to find a way that was less concerned with the larger picture that resulted from these elements, and more concerned with the actual quality of the pieces as things that had a kind of life.
It's a great pleasure to introduce our respondent this evening, our very own Professor Gloria Becker, who holds the IIAV Chair on Gender and Ethnicity in our university. Professor Wecker is a social and cultural anthropologist specializing in gender, African American studies and Caribbean studies, with additional interest in topics as widely ranging as clinical psychology, but also I want to add cultural activism and poetry. The bulk of Professor Wecker's the research concerns the construction of subjectivity and sexuality among Creole working class women in Suriname. This research interest has become a lifelong project of sorts, and I think a longitudinal project, they call it in anthropology, which has resulted in the publication of a very important book, The Politics of Passion, Women's Sexual Culture in the Afro-Surinamese Diaspora by Columbia University Press in 2006. Extremely well received, Professor Wecker's book was awarded the Ruth Benedict Award in 2007 by the Society of Lesbian and Gay Anthropologists. Please welcome our very own Gloria Wecker.
Thank you, Rosie. Thank you, Paul, for a very thought-provoking lecture, which very densely and dazzlingly laid out some of the very urgent issues of our time. Your ability to shift between macro, meso, and micro levels of analysis and to draw all of them into a coherent trajectory is kind of astounding to me. And I will make it my mission to ask you for clarification on some issues, while I will also be commenting from a Dutch perspective on some of the issues you've laid out. We're indeed very honored to have you with us in Utrecht. And more generally, I would like to thank you for the responsibilities that you have taken on as a public intellectual, in the sense that Said lays out, to speak up for unpopular causes and ideas, to side with those who generally haven't been given a voice or whose discourse hasn't received public space, to think in a utopian, cosmopolitan frame of mind. You call up a mild kind of hopeful despair as the most appropriate response to our current planetary predicament. And this is the mood that perhaps best sums up my own and many people's current condition. And I'm thinking especially of the pending candidacy of Barack Obama as President of the United States. He seems to embody some of those much needed qualities that are integral to what you call conviviality. So here's my first question. It seems to me that you are willing to give up multiculturalism in favor of conviviality. I may not be right about this, but I would like you to expand a little bit about that. Anyway, Obama seems to me to embody some of those qualities that are called up with conviviality. In a recent speech commemorating the death of Dr. Martin Luther King, he reflected on, and I quote, the capacity to project the I into the thou, to recognize that no matter what the color of our skin, no matter what faith we practice, no matter how much money we have, no matter whether we are sanitation workers or US senators, we all have a stake in one another. We are our brother's keeper, we are our sister's keeper, and either we go up together or we go down together. Now, in these words, he really seems to embody conviviality, the ambition to be convivial to me. So I believe that we are heading for a historical shift, which will affect each and every one of us around the globe. And I would like to invite you, secondly, to reflect in your response on what having not just a black male president, but this particular man, with his particular biographical profile as the President of the United States, what it might mean for us and for a global culture of conviviality. Okay, I feel called upon in addition to situate in a Dutch context some of the dance processes you have been talking and writing about. And I will name 3 such patterns, while I cannot go deeply into them because I really would like to leave time for dialogue with the audience. I have taken this very thick cluster that you have outlined to heart. The colony as a place of governmental experiment and innovation, about the intensity of state-driven violence and martial law as the regular mode of interacting with the colonized. And also part of that thick configuration is the erasure of the colonial past and the current refusal to face racism. Now there are a number of things I would like to say about that situation, looking at it from a Dutch angle. And I think your project also is very akin to what David Theo Goldberg is doing when he is talking about racial Europeanization. And so all of these parts of a kaleidoscope is the metaphor I would like to use, that also a Dutch would also necessitate reflection on the Dutch situation. So I was very struck by this emphasis that you put on state-driven violence and martial law as a mode of interacting with the colonized. I have just embarked on a new project of reading along gendered lines of a very ancient text. It's called Essai historique sur la colonie de Suriname. It was written by a company of Portuguese Jewish men in 1788. Now what is very interesting is the different bonds and affiliations that are formed in the colony at that time, and that depending on the particular situation, different groups of people get together. And whereas the Jewish planters and the Christian planters are most of the time at each other's throat, when it comes to standing up against the main danger in the colony, which is the runaway slaves, 5,000 to 6,000 Maroons in 1700, they form a company, they band together against those Maroons. Now, in rereading this text, I was struck by the extent of the violence, which is totally naturalized in the book, and which in my own mind, I have to say, also had become naturalized. I am struck by the continuity of that violence as it was first shown up in the colonial setting and how it has continued. I would like to point out 2 other examples which also speak to the continuity of a colonial mindset. One of them is what you were earlier referring to as the sociology of ignorance, which also is very much part of the Dutch configuration. Race very much is an implicit and very forceful but unspoken about grammar of our lives. This is not only true in the way, for instance, that ministries take care of different groups of people, whereby the racial profile of a particular group determines in what ministry they will be looked at. So, for instance, when we look at the example of women, there is a distinction made between women, generally, then you have black migrant and refugee women. This goes to your point about how people in the Netherlands always stay strange and coming from elsewhere. That is a category. And then there is the category of people coming from the third world. Now this is a very time-honored marker of difference on which is built on race, but this is hardly something that gets a lot of attention. And it is present everywhere. It's like omnipresent. It's not only at the level of ministries that we see it operative, we also see it in the academy, in the way, for instance, that within the discipline of history, history of the colonial past is taken out of there and moved into a place where it kind of forms a separate, not connected part that is not connected to national history or entertains very few ties. A third example that I would like to give from the Dutch context is a statement recently made by our Prime Minister Balkenende, from which imperial melancholia could be scooped up with a big spoon. This was when he uttered the statement that we were in the Netherlands in bad shape, since we weren't working hard enough, and we should take an example and look at the mentality of the Dutch East India Company, which colonized the Dutch East Indies for centuries, and should go back to that kind of mentality. So even though there was some uproar about that, and he even in the end made his apologies, it does speak to the, what I have called the innocence unlimited as far as race and racism is concerned in the Netherlands. Okay, much more could be said about this, but I will wind to an end by asking two final questions of you. I fully underwrite your endeavor in the most general terms, but I think that I would like to recommend that your work could be strengthened by making intersectional analysis. That is an analysis that doesn't only once in a while pay attention to gender, but does so integrally and on a par with race. It is also in keeping with the genealogies of the emergence of these grammars of difference to think them simultaneously and how they co-construct each other. It is also not unheard of to have people who privilege sexual difference and single it out as the more foundational difference. But I am of the opinion that we need to think them simultaneously. So I would like you to comment on that. Finally, I would like to ask you whether in the current situation that we're in which it seems that at the moment blacks are not the most unassimilable other, but have in some respects gained some kind of assimilability, and Muslims are the ultimate other, how that figures in your theoretical framework.
Well, thank you, Gloria. That's a wonderful list of things to engage, and I'm really grateful to know. Where to begin? Well, I begin, yes, mild kind of hopeful despair. That's roundabout right. Barack Obama, let's start. I thought all about him. I know the importance, the currency of these symbols. I don't like the idea that that's what we can start with him, because I want him out of the way, really. I don't like the idea that this is where we begin to dig, you know? I was always struck, one of my Palestinian students sent me a photograph, actually, of Barack Obama and Mrs. Obama, whose name I do not remember, Michelle, thank you. Michelle and Barack having a dinner with Edward Said in Chicago. I'm sure some of you have seen this photo. With Edward Said in Chicago, at a conference, exactly. And I suppose I was very struck by that photograph, because it was clear how that time would have been spent and what the conversation would have entailed. And subsequently, I've been waiting for some hints, you see. Now, I know that we can always say, well, there's things he can't say and things he can't do and so on. But when he then says, you know, I want the American military fully engaged from Kandahar to Baghdad, my heart begins to kind of, well, to turn more in the direction of despair than hope. And I know that it will make a difference, and I know it's important, but when I read the Andrew Sullivans and all these people who are saying, America needs a man at the helm who's middle-aged saying, he needs this because it will rebuild the brand, and I've got terribly interested in what they now call cultural diplomacy. The forms of power which correspond to the info war, which don't involve military might, but which correspond to the cultural power of the US. To the fact that, let's deal with universities. Of the top 100 universities in the world, 37 of them are American. 37. I usually carry around the figures about PhDs, about who's being awarded PhDs in the States. But I think it's something like 50% of people who award PhDs are people who are either migrants or the children of migrants. 50% of the people who are starting up companies in the States are the children of migrants or migrants themselves. So there's an incredible cultural power which is there, which I think is an issue for us, actually. And it takes us into an area, a very difficult area, where we are forced to confront the kind of cultural power of the US that informs our own practice as intellectuals and agents and publishers and scholars, I remember talking to somebody about who had been involved in dialogue, and I'd been written to myself actually by a Dalit group from India, who was saying, we want to translate things. We want to translate. In fact, I had heard from the same publisher who wrote to me that they'd been translating the Combahee River Collective statement into Dalit languages. I thought, they need that, like, they need a hole in the head, I have all the things that they could be. So I'm really worried about the forms of American cultural power we never discuss. We talk about the military, we don't talk about these areas of power. We might think about, 50 Cent on tour in Kosovo and think, well, what's 50 Cent actually doing in Kosovo? Why is he in Kosovo? What's being transacted by his presence there, And then we remember what the Cold War was like, and we think, well, actually, in the cultural Cold War, we don't even have an account of the cultural Cold War that takes in the post-colonial era. All the accounts we have of the cultural Cold War are all things which belong to Europe. Well, let's have an account of the cultural Cold War that takes in this north-south dimension. We lack that. And so, for all those reasons, though I of course want Barack Obama to vanquish other contenders, I feel with him that he's necessary, but he's not sufficient. And it's only really through the seductions of a kind of identity politics, let's say, in which we imagine that he's, that he's, in some sense, the beneficiary of his history. We know there's no reason for that to be true. I mean, I feel a lot better about him if he smoked in public instead of in secret. I feel a lot better about him for that reason. On the question of the colonies, the place of experiment, I'm right. We always think of the colonies behind. And when the abolitionists and the people who struggled for the rights of indigenous people in the 19th century, and those who took up the rights of aborigines and others and critiqued the moral economy of the colony, who critiqued, I think of one of my great heroes in my life is Casement, Roger Casement, or Edith Morel. These people who were criticising what the Belgians were doing, they always imagined that it was sort of atavistic, it was primitive, it was behind the time, that we could bring the light of modernity into this operation, and that would somehow match the telos, we'd all be in step again, because these forms of colonial rule were sort of primitive, and chopping people there, kind of some sovereignty there. It wasn't modern. But actually, I think that those things are the future. I think we have to disabuse ourselves in Europe of the idea that what happens out there is the past and that we are the future. We're not the future. Our future is going to look a lot more like that than it does right now. And it corresponds to the fact that we have to think about what we're going to lose, what we're going to give up from the unsustainable life we've made of ourselves. We have to reverse that. And I think that corresponds also, of course, to the idea that particular kinds of power which grow out of that colonial experiment. We all know the history of fingerprinting. We know these forms of, we know the history of those special bullets that explode that came from fighting colonial wars. Those were the things that came into our lives, from that colonial technologies of death and killing, technologies of population management, a form of biopolitics that doesn't conform to the Foucauldian script and so on. Particular attributes of settler colonialism. I spoke about securitocracy as a place where the line between police power and military power was collapsed. Now, I don't know if that's happening to you, but in our country, in the war, when the war against in Ireland was raging, our intellectual generals and colonels will be writing books about military aid to civil power, and was it really okay for them to do this, and was it legal for them to join hands with the police, and whatever they were doing in private doesn't come into it, but in public they were agonizing about military aid to civil power. Well, when poor Jean Charles de Menezes was getting his head shot off by the police, the people who'd been spying on him when he came out of the building were soldiers. They were soldiers. What were they doing there? They were on secondment. Nobody asked about that. What forms of legal and political authority correspond to that story? So I think, you know, there are lots of things about this colonial history which is disavowed, which point to our future, and that the issue of being in the same present, thinking as part of being in the same present, is fundamental to that. That's not the past. That our future will look more like that, believe me. If you want to know what our future is going to be like, we don't think that we are ahead. We have to meet the challenge of being in the same present. On the question of ignorance, I think the term, you know, that people use, starting to use now, is the term agnotology. You remember when we were in Berlin, and I think maybe it wasn't the time. Londa Schibbing was there, you know, the historian of science, feminist historian of science, very famous, and I had a terrible row with her. One of the things that comes out of her books, and the books of her intellectual collaborator and life partner, Robert Proctor, is a refined sense of the politics of ignorance in particular institutional setting. Her book, Plants and Empire, which is a book I admire very much, I'm sure some of you know this book, is a book which centers on the control of knowledge within the plantation system. And she's particularly engaged by the history of those women among the slaves who promoted abortion through the knowledge of which herbs were abortifacient herbs. And she looks at the control of this information within the context of that plantation system as an instance of what she calls agnotology. Agnotology, the cultural reproduction of ignorance, agnotology. Particular kinds of ignorance inhere within a certain institutional arrangement. And she tries, I think, in a very, what I find inspiring, even though I totally disagree with that about lots of things, to refine our tools, intellectual equipment, our toolkit, in thinking about how ignorance is managed and reproduced, how it inheres within a particular institutional setting. Well, if the history of the Dutch East India Company can be sort of summed up like that by a politician, then maybe your secondary school curriculum, and the idea of someone in our country standing up and saying, we've got to summon up the spirit of the East India Company, is unbelievable, because nobody knows that there was any such thing. Actually, nobody has ever thought about it, nobody ever thought about the idea that there were forms of, I mean, actually, I'll tell you where there's one place where people discuss this. What if you know where it is? It's like many things. It's in the business school. It's in the business. That's where they learn the history of the East India Company. They talk about it as part of a history of corporate power. That's what they do. They study the life of a corporation as a particular kind of private entity. So I think we have to catch up and move past that. We don't have a history of a corporation. We don't have a sense of these, where private government enters this story. We know, of course, that half the people who are fighting in Iraq are mercenaries who belong to private companies and contractors and all these kinds of devices, but we don't necessarily assimilate that history to a history of colonial government. Actually, it's a resumption of certain things that were going on in the field of colonial administration over a long period of time, and which don't look anomalous, that don't look futuristic when we understand them. So when we think of them as being anomalous, we're revealing our own ignorance of that history, and we must be engaged. Okay. On the issue of Islam, I got drawn into this partly because I became very interested in the history of converts. What is a convert in this story? And in particular, in the kind of transition I mentioned from a Caribbean-dominated black community at home to an African one, to the assimilation of the descendants of Caribbean settlers and migrants into a political Islam. You know, when I lived in Birmingham, in my 20s, I was doing my PhD, there was, on my street in Birmingham, there was a mosque, and there was a blues dance. They were about 3 doors apart from each other. And I would go past the blues dance, or I'd see them putting the sound boxes in ready for Friday night. At the time, I would go down to do my washing, and they would be going into the mosque for Friday evening prayers. And there was no one from that black community who went into the mosque. And then eventually there was one person. And I think the idea of answering the attractions of a kind of post-Baptist post-Christian communalism, you know, is something that we can only understand in two ways: in relation to the injuries of racism, of course, in relation to the function of the prison system as a place where these relationships are worked out, and really, well, I was going to say, what do you think? What was it? I think it was something to do with the idea that if someone thinks of you as the worst possible thing you can be, you immediately want to kind of inhabit that, really. You want to inhabit the worst possible. The government, it's like being told you can't wear hijab, you know. If someone tells you you can't wear hijab, what are you going to do? First thing you do is you're going to look for a hijab to put on. So, and I think there's something of the sort of rhetoric of evil and the kind of the issue of all of this, which corresponds to the desire to actually inhabit the position. If you're already rejected and already marginalised, to inhabit that the worst possible position and stand on that ground and say, bring it on. Yeah. And I think there's a lot of that machismo going on, machismo going on there, particularly, I think, because the form of blackness that people inhabit now, certainly around my neighbourhood, doesn't really correspond to the history of migration. As this new black community emerges, there's a kind of generic, I called it in my talk, a generic export. There's a sense in which the young people, very often, the men and women, young people whose grandparents were migrants from the Caribbean or from Africa, wherever they come, and of course the younger ones who maybe migrated themselves as refugees or asylum seekers or whatever, the ground on which they encounter one another is the ground of a generic blackness that they've seen on the video. That's where they meet. You know, they meet on the ground, the fantasy ground of the video. They don't have the historical resources to understand that predicament as anything other than young African Americans at a certain distance. And the tragic consequences of that vacuum are apparent to everybody. Well, on the question of intersectionality, obviously that's true. And so really I feel what you're asking me, what I hear in your question is, why don't I put those things more into the front of my analysis? And I suppose I think I've got that answer. Probably, I don't want to sound offensive about this, but I will articulate it and see what you think. I'd like to hear what you say in reply. You have a department of gender studies here, don't you? A gender studies program. Do you have a department of racial and post-colonial and ethnic studies in this university? Is there any institution in this country that corresponds to the history of post-colonial people that isn't part of solving the problem by the government? You know, I mean, we don't have that in our country. We do not have it. And one of the reasons I went back to our country is because of my dream to make such a place. And to be able to combine the strengths of such a place with a kind of policy critique role, with an archive role, and with a place of training people in multidisciplinary ways to do the kind of historical work that we need to do in order to understand ourselves and speak to the future. And I think it's interesting. That's one layer. The second layer is that I've been amazed and inspired, of course, intimately by the fact that that people want to study gender and sexuality historically and critically. Sometimes feminists, but sometimes not always by feminists. There's many issues there. But I've also been aware, and maybe this is my experience being in the States, right? Maybe this is my experience in the States. That actually, that was an acceptable kind of thing to do. That space was won in a different way before I kind of arrived in it. When I got to Birmingham as a graduate student, that's all anybody wanted to talk about, actually. And it produced rows and explosions, it was invigorating, it was exciting, people cried, they slammed, they went out the door. I'm not talking about women now. They slammed the doors and ran down the corridor. And yet, when I said to them, well, look, let's talk about the question of racism in this, they weren't so keen to engage that conversation. Now, so the only issue is, well, then the issue becomes the question of whether an intersectional analysis, what I think of as an analysis of mutual articulation, where things are mutually constituted, solves those, either the strategic problems or the interpretive ones. And I haven't yet found a version of that intersectionality that, for me, solves your own anthropological investigations accepted. I found it difficult to find that in a way that, you know, I think when it comes to gender, dynamic nominalism was an acceptable thing to be into, right? But the people who were interested in dynamic, the function of a dynamic nominalism, weren't so engaged by the question of race. It became, oh, well, we can't talk about that, because if we do that, we use Zerkin. And also, I think, and this is, I'm being very candid actually about this, so I'm sort of interested in it because it's come up and it's not something I talk about in public. How can I put it? I wonder what's become of feminism, actually. I don't live in a place where there's a feminist movement anymore. In the same way, I don't inhabit a place where there's a socialist movement anymore. Those movements don't exist. I mean, of course, there's an incredible struggle these last few weeks. You know, there's a question about fertility control. All those issues about terminations, the legal basis of all of this have been raging, but there's no feminist voice there in that. There's no feminist movement there. And certainly the younger women I encounter in my family and in my teaching life and so on don't define themselves in that way. And I wonder if there's something about the way these analyses have developed which has somehow put them in a position where either they take things entirely for granted or they don't want to inhabit them. And I wonder then what intersectionality says to a post-feminist formation. You know, what does intersectionality do to that? So these are my own confusions. I'm not comfortable with the language of intersectionality that exists for me. In the US, on college campuses where I was working, there was a mantra. People say, oh, race must be. Then there were certain things, it was like Israel, actually. There were certain things you had to say about Israel, which meant that you were a proper person, and then you could stand on the podium and speak. And if you didn't stick to that script, you were in trouble, right? Same true with a certain kind of rehearsed script that won you the space in which to engage a conversation. But that, for me, that was a problem, you know. So, and actually, there were few people, usually, I think, I'm sorry to say, of our own vintage, you know, who were prepared to challenge that. You know, I mean, a good example would be, say, someone like Judith Butler, who we all admire, you know, would stand up and say, you, Judy Butler fans who come here to hear about LBGT, right? I'm going to tell you about torture, or I'm going to tell you about Adorno, or all these other things which are bothering me, and which I think you ought to think about. And they would all, you know, sit there very quietly, and then they would leave, right? So, but I think, you know, I think there's a historical problem. There's a historical problem that we have to kind of admit. And I just don't know what to do. So that's the honest answer. That's the best I can do.
Okay, thank you very much for this inspiring paper. I'm Gay Diane, by the way. I'm also part of this group, the School of Europe meeting here, visiting Utrecht. I would like to pick up where Gloria left, which is the Muslims being the ultimate other now. And the comment/question I have has two parts. One is about, we have been critical in all these years about liberal multiculturalism and how we the tokenism and all the rest of it. But I think it came to a point, especially with the securitization, I was using the word instead, which I didn't do it now. In this age, I think it's really important for us to go back and revisit the most barbaric form of racism back again. Now it has become almost legitimate to be outright, openly, barbarically racist, insofar as the Muslims are concerned. So I agree with Gloria's point about that. And I'd like to invoke Theo Goldberg's argument about the racial Europeanization, where he talks about how making Holocaust as the quintessential and only example of racist past of Europe kind of legitimizes the surviving all sorts of other racism in Europe. And then I would like to invoke Primo Levi's, which Agamben also uses, book about the camp. The camp had also had its forgotten element, which was called the Mussuri. which was the constituting outside of the camp. So in a way, that forgotten part of the camp, that forgotten history, well, Primo says we can, well, the story we are hearing actually is not the story of the victim. The victim's story is the story of those who disappeared. So as you know, the Musulman was the name, just for people, was the name of the Jews that were about to leave that, who were about to die, who has left humanity. They were on the edge of women and envy. So that Muslim, I think it's quite simple. So to cut the story short, that outside of European racist history is very much alive today, which is also making the barbaric racism quite legitimate. So don't you think it's time to visit multiculturalism, which we have been in some ways critical of, and rightly so, which has been called the defense of purpose. But don't we, when we are revisiting it, don't you think we need to attend to the question of Islam in Europe?
Hi, I'm Margaret Valenta. I had one question that had to do with your critique of American models and the export of those, of multiculturalism. And that's something I've been looking at, is the ways in which Americans have been reading what's going on in Europe. And it seems like there's two narratives, rather patronizing narratives. On the one hand, you have the neoconservatives who say, oh, those Europeans, they're wimps, they don't dare to stand up to Islam, and we have to help them get a little bit of background, and otherwise we're going to be overrun. And then you have the progressive one that says, oh, those Europeans, they're so racist and ethnocentric, and they don't really know what they're doing. And if they would, listen to us or look at themselves a bit more critically the way we do, then they would see their sins and failures and shape up. And what I'm wondering is, because it sounds like to me that the critique you're making is also not just of the neoconservatives, but of the progressive multiculturalist critique. And the ways in which it participates in the hegemonic moment of America. Would you go that far, that you would say a multiculturalist, Americanist critique of European responses to immigrants, to Islams, to minorities, is part of that American hegemonic moment? And then the second question, very quickly, about the model of conviviality. It's a neighborhood model. I'm wondering what happens when you take it up to another level, when you take it to the national level and to the global level. What does global conviviality look like? Is that something that could stand up to, the World Economic Forum, American military, that sort of thing?
I have seen a huge research of colonial nostalgia in Egypt, where I did my research, and it was very much related to neoliberalism and elite privileges and gated communities and a kind of what people call the revival of pre-Nasser. Social stratification, exclusion, and so on. And of course, very illiberal governments. A lot of at the same time, this colonial nostalgia also had a kind of cosmopolitan component, which reverberates very much with the kind of elite cosmopolitanism in the West, I think. And so your story, you link to some of these same phenomena. You haven't talked much about class dimension, which, in Egypt was very straightforward. It's like you want to build a gated community, you call it Ismaili or Khalifa Ismail, or you refer back to the colonial past, and it is all of a sudden beautiful and liberal and I don't know what. So could you say something more about that? And the other question I had, which links up to yours, is we have been talking a lot about Islamophobia here, we've been trying to organize against it, we've been talking about cultural racism, but nobody wants to listen. So could you say something about who will listen to your story? How can we make people listen, or what stories can you tell that actually do work against these kind of very racist, conservative things? Because we have had like 10 meetings, I think, with anthropologists saying, we are putting this thing out and we're saying this is cultural racism, but nobody wants to listen. We don't get into the media, people don't accept our letters, and so on. So this remains a big issue, I think, in Europe.
Well, of course that's true. I mean, I'm sorry, because I wanted to say a lot before. I tried, to acknowledge some of these dimensions by saying that the future of the overdeveloped world is going to look a lot more like the future of the developmentally arrested world, the developing world, and these other worlds that are out there, which are part of our present, okay, which are not teleologically separated. There's no escalator of development there. There's a kind of simultaneity, and I think that is where you'll find, I assume, I don't know what the rules are here, but at the end of my street in London, they're trying to build a gated community there too. And when you go to object to the fact that this is being built there, the idea of it being a gated community is not an acceptable objection. You can't say, we like the development, we don't want it to be gated, because that's not a proper objection. Okay, the law doesn't allow you to say that. You have to say other things about it. So I think that the segregation, the sort of spatial relationships involved in these forms of privacy, are going to look a lot more like the colonial space. And I would put Egypt as a post-colonial space, not least, of course, because we know about the extent of US aid, which is shaping that way that state organises its own affairs, second only to Israel, actually, as you know, in the world, as a recipient of US aid. So there are some questions about what Egypt is, and about the patterns of economic and political life there, which correspond very closely, actually, to the things I was trying to suggest to you about the export of US cultural models. Yes, I agree completely. I would go as far as saying that the US progressive commentary or critique of multicultural Europe corresponds to what I think of as that imperial power, and it's not just me saying it now. You know, the people in Brazil saying it, who didn't want to have their race recorded on their identity card, who didn't see that that was the best way of fighting the racism which is deforming their public life. There are people in South Africa who were saying it too, who didn't like people from the US getting off the plane and saying we're returnees. It's just like the US here. Although I suppose after what's been going on there these last few weeks, then there weren't quite so many of them saying that. I remember being at a kind of conference in South Africa some years ago when African Americans got up who announced themselves as returnees, although they couldn't speak Zulu, and started to say things like that. A very polite South African turned to the woman and said, "I think you'll find that black people are a majority here." So I think, we are a little bit reluctant, I suppose, to engage these questions outside of the argument about military power, because we all know, we all want to go and we all want to go and live in America. We love, the music or the films or whatever it is. So there's an ambivalence about all of this, and that is something which is significant and extends in a very difficult way into the hip hop era, where what counts as American culture in the world is African American culture, actually. And that creates all sorts of issues. I know I'm very indebted to Penny Von Eschen's book, I'm sure many of you know, Saxophone Blows Up the World, about the place of jazz in the Cold War period, and the Congress of Cultural Freedom, and all these initiatives that send African Americans out into the world, being African Americans as a way of showing their freedom to the world, and inviting the world into sharing that culture of freedom, which is a world historic phenomenon, just as Du Bois fantasized it would be. It is, he was right, it did become a world historic development. The question is that freedom culture still pending? And my view is no, that it hasn't, that it's been succeeded and erased by a consumer culture which rewrites the terms of that racial hierarchy. So that freedom culture is present, but it's residual now. And we have to do some real work in order to make sense of the transition. Accepting one little acknowledgement in Homo Sacer over where the camp came from as a piece of political technology. And he says, well, it comes from Cuba and it comes from South Africa and it enters the world of modern government from these colonial spaces. That's all. He's not interested in that question. So I think I want to restore that Holocaust to history. That's why I made a comment about it, because I want to restore it. I don't want it to be a sublime eruption of unfathomable evil, actually. That doesn't help anybody. And I think Levy, and I'm thinking here not of the book that Hayden referred to, Is This a Man?, which is an interesting book for other reasons, but of the last book of Levy, the last book before the suicide of Levy, if you accept that, I view it that way, The Drowned and the Saved. And when Levy talks in The Drowned and the Saved about the concentrationary universe, he says that one of its defining characteristics was the fact that there was slave labour there. He speaks not, and I think Agamben confuses this, of the death factory. He speaks of the camp as an adjacent space close to the death factory, which acquires a certain quality of rationality by virtue of its proximity to the death factory. And let's note also that the history of colonial life that I'm invoking here corresponds also to the history of the death factory. Whether it's your Shark Island story, or the story of Eugen Fischer and the Rehoboth bastards, Eugen Fischer standing at the ramp by the trains, teaching the SS physicians to read the bodies of people as they disembarked from the train so that he knew where to send them, to the camp or to the death factory. And there's a history that you've also, of course, I'm sure, seen a beautiful photograph of Eugen Fischer, who writes the race textbook that Hitler reads in Landsberg, sitting next at the meeting of the Nazi rectorate in his uniform to Heidegger, right? And our friend Benham Muller-Hill, in his book Murderous, Murderous something, I can't remember the title. Anyway, Benham Muller-Hill went to interview Fischer's daughter about her father's later life, and she recounts a story of how she nursed her father through his illness, and he would go to visit Heidegger, and Heidegger would come to visit him, and Benham Muller-Hill finally plucks up the courage to say, "Did you hear what they were talking about?" And she said, "Well, yes, actually, I did hear what my father and Heidegger were talking about 40 years after they were pictured in their black uniforms under the Nazi flag of the rectorate as rectors of different universities. And, well, what was it? Here's the punchline, the rabbit comes now out of the hat. Well, they talked about the plight of the white man in Africa. That's what they were talking about." So there are ways of telling better stories about our traditions as Europeans, if I may be so bold, which actually speak to the currency of that history. And I think in Levy's last book, In the Drowned and the Saved, he does that. And remember, this is a book not only close to his own suicide, it's a book which is there against the backdrop of the invasion of Lebanon in the early 80s, and he speaks in a very coded way that caused a lot of trouble in the way that his biography is written, of a critique of the state of Israel in that book. He speaks of the silent Nazi diaspora. He distinguishes between those who are Nazis and those who imitate the Nazis in their political habits. And there's a lot in that book, actually, which I think is different. So I don't buy the idea of the Muslim man as a constitutive outside. I'm not saying there's no issue there, but I don't see it the way that you see it. And I think there's a different reading of Levy that I mean, if we had more time, we could talk about it, which actually speaks to the way that the history of that particular set of political technologies develops in relation to Europe. And it's not just, of course, a question of the camp, where the camp came from, who's in the camp, what laws obtained in the camp, the laws of a lot of things that Agamben raises, but then sets aside because he isn't really interested in the particularity. I mean, you could say, if you wanted to defend him, as I do very often, that the horror of his argument is even more is a kind of more intense version of these merely trivial things to do with racism that interest me, right? But I don't buy. I think if that were true, he could make a little bit more space in his argument for the kinds of things that interest us. And, in the history of Italy, let's say, there is plenty to say about Ethiopia. I believe I'm right in saying that you can't, the Lion of the Desert still can't be shown on Italian television, right? Never mind, what's going on in Rome and what's going on the slopes of the mountain in Napoli. So let's understand that there's a much bigger story here to tell about Europe, and that people who are the champion defenders of European rationality do not want this story told. They do not want this story told in this way, because they understand that telling the story in this way makes them complicit with those barbarities. And there is a lot of, and that's true, it's not just the Heidegger archive that suffers from this, the Kant archive suffers from this, the Hegel archive, or in each place there are these very tenacious guardians of those unsavory elements within that would fall foul of the tide of political correctness, which, as you all know, is sweeping everything before it in the world, if only that were true.
A footnote to that, so we had Jürgen Habermas speaking in this country not so long ago to a crowd of 1,100 people, something like a month or so ago, on the post-secular condition. And it was indeed the spirit of the European Enlightenment bringing order and reason to a world in turmoil. And if only everybody could follow the glorious tradition of rationality, you know, stuff, the blah, blah, blah. So, 1,100 people, I thought, well, I can't really let this go. So I just timidly raised my hand and asked a very polite and dignified question about all the work done by race and gender and sort of ethnicity scholars over the last 20 years, and whether any of that research, including Paul Gilroy's theory of planetary cosmopolitanism, didn't maybe modify some of Habermas' glorious belief in the powers of European rationality. And the answer was extremely decent about it. He said, oh yes, extremely important work. We have a lot to learn from race and gender theories. However, I haven't read any of it since 1995. In public. In public. Okay, so thank you, Professor Habermas, to rest my case. So if only we could defeat ignorance at its highest, most powerful, most significant levels.
We talk about this sort of reconfiguration of the black diaspora in Britain around sort of Afro community where internal differences are sort of blurred. This is how I understood. And I was just thinking last Sunday, I was walking in Paris, I live there, and there was a huge manifestation, and I came closer. It was a lot of music, cool music, African music, salsa, whatever. Majority of black people demonstrating, and basically it was what I found out, it was an evangelist manifestation. And they were singing about Jesus and everything, and they were spreading flyers, and it was a very nice atmosphere. So I continued walking around, so I progressed, and then at one point there was a white spot with a lot of white people in this cortege, and they were all carrying flags, Israeli flags, and talking about they say we love Israel. So it was like one part in this huge manifestation was a Zionist evangelical group. And so I was really surprised. I mean, I had heard about these massive conversions to evangelism in France. I had never seen it so truly in front of me. And then on the other side, you have in France a big majority of black Muslims from West Africa and also Congress and so on. So I was like thinking, you see here something on the like metropolitan fun music and so on scale, but you see.
What's the question? What's the point?
Yeah, this is what I come now. It's difficult for me. I'm not very good English speaker, so So yeah, so I was just thinking there was a sort of on a local scale you had a sort of you see how two very different constituencies are constructed with very different and antagonist political agendas. And somehow you can say here money comes from elsewhere, constitute this group. So how do you take account this?
Last question, then, Marcia.
Okay, I want to move to a more mundane level.
Shopping.
Soccer.
That's not a more mundane
That is deadly serious.
When we are orange-painted faces celebrating our victories, would that be a space for conviviality, or would that be a space for national absolutism?
Well, actually, in a way, they're the same question, actually, it seems to me. Because the question about religion, and evangelical religion in particular, is, I think, one that I would answer by referring to the idea of a convivial space. That actually people, the lines of fracture and conflict which emerge there are not racial or cultural, actually, at all. In fact, they've been suspended, postponed, deferred, managed, through the orchestration of this kind of rhapsody. This religious rhapsody. And I see this too because, where I live, the Catholic Church is sort of now full of Poles and Filipinos, Irish people aren't there, and the evangelical church is full of Brazilians and Africans from every direction of Africa. And I think that's a really fundamental change. And what that constituency becomes in its political moment is not yet clear, actually. You don't know what that's going to be. And certainly it's not the Black Atlantic in any form that it was before, and actually I should have said earlier on that the Black Atlantic that now interests me is the Black Atlantic of the bodies that are washed up on the shores of Spain, the Black Atlantic of the people in Lampedusa, the Black Atlantic of the people who are coming in small boats, not. Although when you ask them about their experience, they often use the history of the other maritime journey to narrate their experience of suffering and anxiety and fear. On the issue of football, depends who's in the team, actually, I think, is the answer to that, and how the cosmopolis in the stadium relates and interacts with what's happening in the dressing room. As you all know, that's been a problem for you in the past. What's been happening and what happens on the pitch, right? And I think, I don't know, I mean, you know, where we live, we are close to the Arsenal Stadium. I've always thought, the legend I was given was that Van Persie was someone who spoke Dutch with a Moroccan accent. Is that true?
Yes, Moroccan wife.
Well, I know, I was coming to that next, actually. I was coming to that next, because it was always said at a certain point that his place in the script of the team was something that was soured by the idea that he was rather too familiar with some of the convivial patterns of street life in the neighbourhood in which he grew up, you know, which is an interesting thing for me to contemplate too. Now, my own experience as someone who doesn't support England, and has never supported England, and has always wanted England to be destroyed and smashed as hard as possible, and who actually is very, very happy at the idea that they won't be taking part in this, because although my political voice says, well, of course, it feeds the melancholia of their victimage, right? But it also gives us an opportunity. It gives us an opportunity to say to the people, well, who are you going to support in this pageant that unfolds? How are you going to identify what connections? And of course, given that they're all the same players that play for your teams anyway, right? Or many of them are, how will those local allegiances intercut and become articulated together with national attachments? I think it was very, very hard. And people worked really, 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 you can't imagine the work that went into forcing open expressions of racism out of the football stadiums in our country. And every time I go to the football, I give thanks for that. And I can't believe it happened. It's like, you know, the overthrow of apartheid. I never imagined that entering that space would be possible. There wouldn't be the racist chanting, that there wouldn't be the bananas coming over, that there wouldn't be all of that being enacted. And it's gone. It's gone. Now, I'm not being complacent in that, because the work has to be done to keep it out, and as we all know, there are lots of other parts of Europe where where we haven't been able to use the power of these sporting cultures, you know, in order to access that political possibility, that utopian possibility. But I do think it's an incredible resource for us to be able to actually open the idea that exposure to difference, albeit within tightly scripted, because it's not something that involves loss, but something that involves an opportunity and a form of pleasure and joy. So I think it's both, neither, but really it depends on who's in the team. And the last point is the one I forgot to answer earlier on, which is that my experience of the US is, and David Goldberg's theory I have a lot of difficulties with, and he's a sort of local hero, so I have to be careful what I say, but I think there's a tone about a lot of this discussion which suggests that America has everything that's best in the world, including the best racism, right? And yesterday, one of my students sent me an article written by, she's not American, although she's lived there, she's Indian actually, sent me an email from one of her friends who said, look at what's going on in Italy. Look at that. Isn't it terrible? These Europeans are much more, this is someone who's progressive in every question, says, you know, look at this. It's terrible. Of course it is terrible what's going on. It's absolutely dreadful what's going on. But saying, look, see, in America we've got 32% migrants, Italians have got 6%, and look what's happening. You see, we're much better than they are. We've solved these problems. And I was struck. I wrote immediately back to my student and said, never send me anything else like this, please. I was thinking a lot about something Condoleezza Rice had said the other day. If you remember, in the wake of Hurricane Katrina, I don't know if you remember what she said. I'll quote it actually, I brought it with me because if I had more time I would have got onto this. This is Condoleezza Rice. The US, she says, is about 100% ahead of anywhere else in the world in issues of race. And I say that absolutely, fundamentally. You go to any other meeting around the world and show me the kind of diversity that you see in America's cabinet, in America's foreign service, in America's business community, in America's journalistic community. Show me that kind of diversity any place else in the world and I will be prepared to be lectured about race. we will be making a mistake if we let a lot of people jump to the conclusion that the United States has therefore not dealt with issues of race, particularly if you look at how the issue of race is dealt with in most of the world. Okay? So I think that a lot of that is pending in the Barack Obama presidency. I think it's absolutely pending in that Barack Obama presidency. And, you know, I mean, so what can we say? We just have to wait and see what happens.